Hello and welcome. I'm Liz Booker, Literary Aviatrix, and I'm excited to launch a new series I'm calling Aviatrix Classics with a couple of amazing guest hosts who we'll get to know today. Fewer than 10% of pilots and aircraft mechanics are women. These are their stories of tenacity, adventure, and courage. Stories with the power to inspire, heal, and connect. Welcome to the Literary Aviatrix community, where we leverage the power of story to build and celebrate our community and inspire the next generation of aviation. Jacque Boyd and Jenny Beatty, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting us.
Oh my gosh, this has been in the works for a little while, and I'm so excited to finally get it rolling. Today is our opportunity to get to know you two as our co-hosts for this new project of the Aviatrix Classics books that we're going to go through here. We have a long list, an endless probably list of books that will keep us busy for a long, long time if we continue to pursue it, and I'm excited about that. Before we get into a deep dive into your histories in your careers, let's just give people the top level so they know who we're talking to. So Jacque Boyd, could you introduce yourself?
I'm an educator and a pilot, general aviation background. I've done a lot of writing through the years. I am on the Amelia Earhart Memorial Scholarship Fund with the 99s, which is a circuitous story in itself. Retired. I live in Angel Fire, New Mexico.
Wonderful. And Jenny, how about you?
Yes, I'm an airline captain, and being a pilot has been my only career, going on 40 years as a pilot altogether. And I've been a very long time advocate for women, writing about women pilots, promoting careers to women pilots, and advocating for women in a multitude of ways. And I live in Madison, Wisconsin.
Awesome. Well, welcome to both of you. I am so excited to be able to talk to you and to get to know you better. Let's start with the beginning. So Jenny, how did you get into aviation as a child or whenever that happened for you?
It's a bit of a long story, but I grew up with stories about my grandparents flying, and they learned to fly in 1930, and my mother learned to fly in 1945. So I grew up with those stories, although no one was actively flying when I was growing up. So I was intrigued and interested, and I was deterred, or delayed is a better word, by a high school career counselor who told me I couldn't do it because I'm too short and wear glasses.
Oh.
So that slowed me down for a couple of years. But then I took a discovery flight, and that was it. I was hooked and took lessons, and here I am. I just knew I needed to fly for a living. I loved flying, and that's what I wanted to do. I did not have my sights on being an airline pilot. I did not think that was possible for me, and I didn't dare to dream or hope for it. It just seemed completely out of reach, because when I learned to fly, I didn't know about women airline pilots. Later, when I did hear about a couple of them, there were just so few. There was just a handful. And I just didn't know how they got there and just didn't picture myself getting there. So I flew in general aviation as a flight instructor. I flew for aerial photography. I flew bank checks, light charter. I flew cadavers. And then passenger charter, and did that for a number of years until finally some wise people kept mentoring me, and I finally did decide to try for an airline job. And I finally did get an airline job in 1991, only after I had achieved my ATP on my own, which was very unusual at that time. Most pilots did not, well, it certainly wasn't required at that time. And also many pilots didn't bother getting the ATP until they upgraded to captain at an airline. At the time, that was the only position that required that certificate. But I got it on my own in 1988, when only 1.8 of ATPs were women.
Wow.
And it still took me 3 more years to get the job in 1991. And then that is a whole story in itself. I'm with my fourth airline. So I have a uniform collection going. But I've been with my company now for 25 years.
That's incredible. Before we get to Jacque, though, you mentioned these parents and grandparents who flew. I'm so curious. Tell us just a little bit more about them.
So my grandfather and grandmother lived in Yakima, Washington. They were very progressive minded as far as very modern for their times. They had a small family. They had a son at the time who was 10, and my mother was 2. And and my grandmother was 45 years old. But in 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, he did it for a prize, and the prize didn't specify that you had to fly solo. There were other attempts with crewed aircraft that didn't make it, and then he made it, but he did it by himself. And he became it's a celebrity around the world. It's really difficult for people now to realize what an impact that flight had all over the world. People were captivated by him and by this accomplishment. And it prompted this huge surge of interest in aviation, including my grandparents. And so they were set to do it. They got together with some other business people in their town. They ordered a brand new airplane. They hired a guy to bring it to Yakima, Washington, and they hired this pilot they formed a company. My grandmother was elected president of this airline, and they had a Curtiss Cardinal, which was a cabin airplane. So that was a big deal because it was an enclosed cabin and a bigger engine than some of the aircraft around at that time. Anyway, and then that pilot taught them all to fly. And first my grandfather and then my grandmother. And then later my grandmother owned that airplane outright. It was hers. And I have the propeller from it. I don't have it here in this room right now. Yeah. So I grew up with a lot of stories about her and my grandparents and some of her escapades. Yeah. But I do like to point out she was 45 years old. She was a housewife and the mother of small children. So that's why, for example, she didn't go into the WASP and so on and so on. But she and my grandfather flew around together for a long time.
That's an incredible story. And what a great role model for a little girl to know what's possible for her. That's incredible.
Absolutely. And
Jacque,
my mother as well.
Yeah. Jacque, what brought you to aviation?
Oh, I have 3 older brothers who were always charged with babysitting, and we use that term loosely. And so some of the things that I experienced as the little sister being babysat by brothers, they would put me on the middle bar of the bicycle and we'd go out to the airport and watched airplanes. And, my mother was an educator. My grandfather was an educator. All my aunts and uncles were. And quite frankly, my parents were more concerned about putting a roof over our head and food on the table. No one ever talked about what you could do or what you couldn't do. There were expectations for us, but it was a very different environment. And my oldest brother always wanted to fly. The next brother did too, and I would have to buy a ticket to go into their bedroom to look at all the airplane models that hung from the ceiling, and surprisingly enough, the ticket always cost what my allowance was for that week. So it was just something that was there, but nobody talked a lot about it. I got my bachelor's degree, and my oldest brother had just gotten his flight instructor's rating and gave me a book for college graduation that was called How to Pilot Your Own Airplane. And I thought, I could do this. And there was a bit of a situation that caused some rebellion. And I remember telling my mom that if she didn't see me at school, I would be at the airport. And so I learned to fly in Grand Island, Nebraska, got all my ratings, did all the wonderful things to build time. And I know Jenny can identify with some of this. I flew checks at night. I flew blood.
Jenny mentioned that too, that she flew checks. I think that, all of the older ladies kind of know what that's about, but what was that, Jackie? What does that mean?
Well, it was, you wrote your check, you took it to the bank, they put it together and canceled it, and then you had to fly it to a regional bank for cancellation. And so there was probably a 4 or 5 day process with getting a check through the bank. And it was flown by us little people who were building time. And I'd fly checks at night, and then I'd go and I'd teach. And so it was one of those situations where I had to evaluate just where I was going to go with my flying. Nebraska was extremely active with NASA in aerospace education. Every summer, I took aerospace education workshops. The National Guard would fly us to Houston, to Johnson Space Center in C-130s. It was an extremely different environment. And so all my teaching centered around aerospace education. And I came to the conclusion that I didn't want to go the route of the airlines, and the hiring situation was very interesting. A lot of affirmative action. Some things I agreed with, some things I didn't. And so I took a sharp left turn and went into aerospace education and worked for NASA during the summers. And I applied for an Amelia Earhart Scholarship from the 99s for my master's degree in aerospace education. And there was only one place in the United States that offered that. And it was Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. So I picked up, loaded everything in my little Honda Civic, and moved to Murfreesboro. And was there for a year, and lots of interesting things happened. I met a short little American Airlines pilot, and that kind of changed the trajectory of my life, as did budget cuts. I lost my position with NASA. I was going to finish up at Oklahoma State. That's where the NASA Education Department was housed, and I had a fellowship for my PhD, and that dried up. So I moved to Texas, and all my teaching has always had aviation and aerospace at its base. And so when I got my PhD, my dissertation is in science and math around teachers who took an aerospace education workshop, and did they actually use it in their classrooms. So that's been my background forever as an educator.
Incredible. Now you made some reference to a short little American Airlines pilot. Tell us more about that.
Oh, that my mother was only concerned when I said, I met this guy and he's really neat, and I think I'm going to follow him to Texas, because they closed the base in Nashville and he decided to go to the Dallas-Fort Worth base. And She was very concerned that I would never finish my doctorate. But he was tremendously supportive of everything I did and had expectations. It was one of those, if you can do it, do it. No excuses. So he was tremendously supportive of what I did. And when I got my doctorate, I found out I was not tenure track mentality. So I didn't stay at the university, but one of his first officers at the time wanted to start her family and still fly the line. And American had not been faced with that before. And so I did some consulting and ended up starting a business where I wrote maternity policies for airlines and corporations and universities. It was a different time and place. I wish I could say everything has been solved, but the same problems surface. And God love Jenny. On Facebook, when something happens like that, it's always, have you contacted Jacque Boyd? So that took a 10-year chunk of my life. And after my husband died, he was killed in a small airplane crash. I kind of reevaluated who I was and where I was going to go. And we had bought property in this itty bitty little mountain village in New Mexico. And probably 10 years after he died, I just kind of looked at everything in Dallas, Fort Worth and thought, I don't want to be here anymore. And I picked up and moved to Angel Fire, New Mexico. And got sucked into a little charter high school where I taught aviation, and then became the director, the principal of the school. So it was full circle back to education.
That's amazing. And the impact that you had on the industry through writing those policies is incredible. I want to just take a minute with that because I'm so curious. I was somebody who advocated for women and particularly was involved in having some policy changes made in my organization in the Coast Guard. So this was something that was very important to me. Looking at the things that you implemented or that you suggested that companies implemented through the policies that you wrote back then, are there things that from your perspective, have changed, like recommendations that you would have made back then that you would maybe have done differently in today's world? And the reason I say that is because, for example, I've talked about this a few times. We had this odd little comment in our policy that was referring to a 1980s Army study on chicken embryos that suggested that a pregnant woman who flew in a rotary wing aircraft would potentially be putting her child's hearing at risk, and so it's like we had to debunk this, and get it removed from our policy because it was confusing commanders who were in a position of the trifecta of people who would make a decision about whether a pregnant woman would fly. And so we were able to get that out of there. And I know that, science and understanding of women's bodies has evolved. So I'm just wondering, thinking in that context, were there things that were strange back then that now we've learned and policies have changed?
I've seen it. It's very cyclical. When I first started doing my research, I went to the 99's Museum of Women Pilots and got all of Betty Hyler Gilley's presidential papers out. She was, I believe, the 5th president of the organization. And she had gone toe-to-toe with the CAA at the time. And they reached the point where it was very much hands-off. It was, okay, we're going to back off. Those women can fly. Nothing was ever said. And so when I started, it ran the gamut of what do they wear? How do they interact with the other people in the cockpit? How do they interact with passengers? It was almost more of a social issue than it was a physical issue. I worked with some NASA physicians who it basically came down to, if you're going to have a normal pregnancy, flying will not affect it at all. If the pregnancy is not going to be normal, it really has nothing to do with the flight environment. And so I remember giving a speech at a women military aviators conference, and there was a fellow there who was an aeromedical doctor and told me that women who flew rotary aircraft would have children with learning disabilities. One airline I observed, which was a freight operation, and I said, well, do you have uniforms? And he went, well, no, I think they just get up to altitude and unzip and let it all hang out. And I thought, oh, really? So it's run from a social issue to more of a physical issue. Bob Barris, years and years ago, and I did a presentation at ISA, and it was on the difficulties of radiation and pregnancy.
Yep.
And his recommendation was, if you're a guy and you want to have kids flying that North Atlantic route, you should be just as concerned as a woman. So it's been very cyclical. And every time something comes up about a company not being supportive, or a company putting in barricades to a woman flying when they're pregnant, that hasn't changed. And I started my work in 1991. So
yeah.
I wish it would become commonplace. And I think for a lot of women it has, but it really depends on representation and how open the company is to working with a woman.
Well, thank you for that history, Jacque. I find that fascinating. And Jenny, I know that you have so many issues that you've advocated about, and we will talk about those soon. But I want to just talk briefly about any challenges that either of you personally faced in the field of aviation and how you overcame them. And Jenny, you can start us off.
Well, one of my biggest issues was, it really does help if you have a family member or a close mentor, it might be an aunt or uncle, if it's not a parent, who is in the industry. And I really see in the industry pilots who are able to progress more quickly because they really know where to go. They just know all the shortcuts, and they're not, bypassing, all the milestones that we all have to cross, but they just know what to do at the right time. And because they've got a close advisor to help them. And as I said, I did not have anybody in my family actively flying. And so I had to kind of figure it out on my own. And one of the things I identified is that you really need mentors then. And I did have mentors in different ways and at different times in my life. And what I identified was, just to speak about one area of activity during my career, is that women really need mentoring because there aren't a lot of women in this profession. And for a long time, well, anyway, and so one of the things that I did was help create mentoring programs specifically for women pilots, especially the one in the 99s, which was launched after 9/11. So that's one of the things that I kind of with hindsight, or even at the time, I identified that is a challenge. It was just knowing, how to do things to navigate this career. And then the other big challenge, which I experienced and women to this day still experience, is there is bias and there is harassment of women. And it doesn't serve any purpose other than to discourage women and to try to keep them from progressing, in my opinion. And we also see this happening to Black pilots, Asian, Latina pilots, other pilots who don't fit the traditional model of the white man. And it's kind of saying, this is our club and we don't want you in the club. And that was certainly true for me early on in my career. Less so once I got to a major airline and progressed at a major airline. But what broke my heart was seeing it still happen to younger women coming in on an ongoing basis. And so that's what led to a lot of my other work in advocacy and really highlighting these issues and speaking about it in a big way.
Well, I mean, to some of the things that you just talked about. So I had the privilege of sitting in on one of your panel discussions at the recent Women in Aviation International Conference. I thought you did an excellent job of laying that out. I'm going to get the title wrong, but
Calm comebacks to rude remarks. Mm-hmm.
Calm comebacks to rude remarks, which has been, something that I have been trying to help educate people on, like being prepared for those so that they can shed that in the moment, deal with it, and leave it with that person who said that thing to them instead of carrying that with them for 20, 30 years like the rest of us have had to and wishing that we could have said something different. I think that your work is amazing. While at the WAI conference, I hosted an author reading, and I just kind of talked about how I think, a minority coming into a majority organization or culture, the way in which women came back to aviation post World War II, when they had been told to get back in the kitchen and that was their job. We no longer needed them to do other things that the white men were coming home to do for them. Well, when we came back in isolation, really, like in small numbers and isolated. And so our main survival skill was really assimilation into the culture, whether the culture aligned with our personal sensibilities and ideals or not. If we wanted to fly, we had to adapt to this culture. And so until we get these larger numbers, we needed, so you, a woman in a male dominated environment, you're already sort of they don't know how to deal with you. They naturally mentor the other men around them because they feel comfortable around those guys. And so I experienced that myself, of like not having mentors. So I think that is an important point, an important challenge. And I love the way that, people like you who are challenged by something want to fix it. And so they create processes and systems to fix those problems. And you have been a huge, hardworking example and leader in that way. Jacque, what about you? Did you face any challenges that you needed to overcome in aviation?
I've had conversations with a lot of women who learned to fly when I did. I got my license in 1975. And it was almost as if we put up and ignored and became smart alecks to deal with some of it. And I do think having 3 older brothers affected the way I dealt with a lot of the discrimination. But it was very much a different time. And I think a lot of us figured out what it was we wanted and what we were going to put up with or not to be able to get where we wanted to go. And so the handling of some of the discrimination, there's another woman here in Angel Fire who flew charters in the Caribbean for years. And there have been some conversations we have on our Saturday morning coffee where everybody who flies shows up. And a lot of the men have been very taken aback with our stories and our reactions to what was done back in the 70s and early 80s. And so listening to that difference in perception and how some of the younger women handle things now, and I do believe the mentoring is such a necessary part of it. And I found that through my 99s chapters. A lot of people who were not professional pilots, but had the same sort of discriminatory stories as the rest of us. You know, I will never forget taking a cross country to a small airport, and the manager looked at me and went, "Now, sweetie, you follow those sticks with the blue lights on top until you get to the sticks with the white lights on top, and then you take a right turn." And I thought, I know what taxiway lights look like, and I know what runway lights look like. But you gauged, okay, how much trouble am I going to get if I open my mouth and say what I really think? But I think people like Jenny are giving an approach, an alternative to the frustration that some of us felt years ago, and the camaraderie of a lot of the women's groups. You know, people can say whatever they want about Facebook, but gee, there is some wonderful conversation that goes on. So I've seen it's like everything else. I've seen this come around. It's very cyclical, but I think we have healthier ways to deal with that kind of discrimination than we ever did before.
And I think the younger generation is different in other ways because so women who are in their 20s and 30s now, many of them grew up with mothers who worked versus our generation. And that it was commonplace. You're going to have a career.
As did the men, which changes their attitudes as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But the other thing I saw in my own experience, I got interested in soccer and played pickup soccer starting at age 15. I loved it. You know what? It didn't become a sport at my high school until I was graduating. But nowadays, so my point being, the younger generations, many of these young women were able to be very athletic and be jocks or jockettes, captains of their teams, which is empowering. And they learn leadership. They learn teamwork. They learn about their own skill and power and strength. So they're different than some of these other generations where that was true maybe individually for different individual women, but not as a cohort, as a generational cohort.
And also, I think one of the things that Jacque mentioned where, you know, you tell these stories in front of men who maybe aren't the perpetrators of this. And when you have a generation of men who grew up alongside these girls who were captains of soccer teams, you know, they don't think that it's a problem anymore. But, you know, you could educate them to know that these things still happen and they can be informed allies and support us in constructive ways as well. So it's all good. And Jenny, I've heard you, you did a podcast talking about this specifically about how to help men be supportive in the aviation environment as well.
So that's what it's going to really take. And I think we've seen this because Well, as you mentioned earlier, certainly the more women and representation that we have in raw numbers, percentages, that makes a difference. And we've seen that in other professions as well, that once that we reach sort of a critical mass, there will be more of a shift where some behavior that is tolerated or ignored, or people just look away or sweep it under the rug, it won't be tolerated anymore.
That's right.
But the other thing that really will make a difference is when men hold other men accountable.
Correct. Yeah.
And for behavior in the workplace.
Absolutely.
And in the educational training environment as well.
Now, so I'm curious to know if there was one thing that you would say was your proudest moment or your greatest accomplishment in your aviation related careers. What would that be? Jacque, let's start with you.
Oh, gee. I say my greatest accomplishment is survival. You know, there have been so many little highlights that I can't say there's one thing that has capped anything off. It's just, it's the little things. And I've had a kid in my aerospace class here used to make me crazy, made my hair this color, you know, and he was the base commander at Miramar of the V-22 Osprey Squadron. And I hear from him a lot.
That's
the
awesome.
Kids that I've had through the years that somehow get involved in aviation, and there have been several. It's just those little things that give me the pleasure that I've had in my life, not one certain thing. There have been some awards along the way that have been wonderful, but it's the culmination and the combination of all those little things.
That's wonderful, Jacque. How about you, Jenny?
Well, I echo what Jacque has experienced, where when you have mentored people, helped people, and it might even have been literally one conversation with a person, but when you hear from them years later about what a difference that conversation had and what a shift it made for them, that they were able to either continue with their job, continue with their career, and succeed. And for them to acknowledge your part in that, however small, is incredibly gratifying. And I appreciate that a lot. As far as my own personal accomplishments, well, like I said, when I was set on flying to be a professional pilot, I didn't expect to be an airline pilot. So becoming an airline pilot, being able to fly the aircraft that I have all the way up to the 777 and the 787, fly around the world, that's a pretty big deal.
It is a
so
big
I'm
deal.
pretty proud of that. Yeah. And two flights stand out. At my prior company, where I flew out of Reno, Nevada, I got to fly a charter flight into Yakima, Washington, where my grandparents learned to fly and where my mother learned to fly.
Very cool.
And so that was a big deal for me. And then with my current company, we were getting new 737s from the Boeing company, and I put together this whole project to honor the women at my company and saw this whole project through where we flagged one 737 coming off the assembly line to be delivered to American Airlines. And we had a woman captain. I was a first officer at the time, so I flew as the first officer. Our entire crew was women, and we invited a lot of prominent women from the company to be there. Also, women from the Boeing company were the test pilots. Trish Beckman was involved. So, and then we flew the aircraft out of Boeing Field. We were taking it to Chicago, and we flew. Oh, and my mother. We were able to invite, because it was a private flight and not a commercial flight, we were able to invite our friends and family. And so my mother was on the flight with me, and we flew past Yakima. We were able to look out the window and see it. And she, again, because it was a private flight, and under a different part of the regulations, they were able to visit the cockpit. So my mother was able to be in the cockpit and observe me flying. And so that was a real highlight of my career.
Those are such neat experiences. Well, now I want to kind of transition here a little bit because there's a reason that you two are here. So Jacque, so I came on the scene a few years ago after I retired from the Coast Guard and needed to get reconnected with the aviation community. And this is, I started the book club. I reached out to WAI, who I'd had a relationship with, asking if I could, I'd written articles for them highlighting the Coast Guard as an employer of choice for women. And so I reached out to the current magazine editor and asked if I could write an article just to get the word out about the book club and everything that I was doing. And that turned into a longer term relationship where I have been writing sort of book features under the Authors Connect column for WAI. Both of you are very prolific writers and have written for many magazines, including WAI. But Jacque, you have been reviewing books for the 99s magazine for far longer than I was, even thinking about any of this. And so when I thought about, the way that I structured the book club and my interviews was that I promised myself that I would only feature books in the book club for which the author would grant me an interview. But what that did was it limited me from being able to read the source material, to read the books that were written by, our pioneering women in aviation. And I really wanted a way to do that. And I wanted to talk about them. And so I thought, well, who better to do that with than Jacque? But also, from the beginning, when I started this project, Jenny has inundated me with her lists of books, her personal, she has a list of her entire library annotated with, which edition it is, what year it came out, all of this stuff. And so when I talked to Jacque about it, and
nerd alert.
I know. So when I talked to Jacque about this idea of hey, let's do an Aviatrix Classics thing, naturally Jenny's name came up, but it's not just because you're a book nerd. It's because you two have this relationship. And I know you two were snickering when I came on the scene. They're like, oh, isn't she cute? She just discovered books. That's sweet. But you guys have been so supportive. And let's hear about this. I want to hear how you guys met and how this whole, you almost have a competition, your book competition got started. So talk to us about that.
Well, what was it? It was a Women in Aviation conference in Las Vegas in 1992. And yep. I was going out to the airport to pick up my best friend, Judy Tarver, who was head of pilot hiring at American, and out she walks with this young woman beside her. And Jenny, you can finish how that happened.
Yeah, so I was flying for a small regional, we called them commuter airlines at the time, and I'd applied to American, and I was jump seating on American Airlines to go to this conference. And at the time, just due to the rules at the time, to jump seat on another airline, and each airline had its own rules, they all still do. But the rules then were a little different, and American had a rule where you had to be in uniform, and you sat in the cockpit. Even if there were open seats in the cabin, you couldn't sit in the back. So I sat up in the cockpit in my uniform to Las Vegas. And along the way, the first officer went up to use the restroom, and he came back up and he said, "Oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe who's in first class, Judy Tarver, and she remembered me." And Judy was amazing because she hired thousands of pilots at American Airlines as the manager of pilot recruitment, but he was really impressed that she remembered him. And so, but that's Judy. And anyway, I was like, because I wanted to work for American Airlines, and he looked at me and he said, "You need to meet Judy." And so I went back there, I was able to introduce myself to Judy. I had just made business cards for the first time. So this is where I gave a lot of talks on networking to college kids and other people. And I was able to give Judy my business card, brand new. And she said, oh, hey, well, you know, I said I was going to the Women in Aviation conference. She said, I'm going too. So she said, well, you need to meet my friend and we'll ride to the hotel together. And that's when I met Jacque. So Judy is still a friend, but I really just hit it off with Jacque, where we just, I don't know, we had a meeting of the minds. It was just instant, it seems like.
And tell us about the books, you two.
You know, I think readers tend to find other readers, and it's one of those where you compare what you've read, and Jenny and I we had this certain site at the time, ABE Books, and you could find some wonderful books, and Jenny would go, I just found this book and I bought it. And you'd think, well, I'm going to buy that book too. Or it was, have you seen how much this book is going for? It was just that constant good-natured competitiveness. And every winter when I get snowed in, I keep thinking I need to put my books on an Excel sheet like Jenny does. Well, I haven't done it yet. But
there's a reason for the Excel sheet. It's because then I would see a book and I would buy it, and then I go home and I'm like, I already have a copy.
Yeah, I have that problem.
So that was like, no, I'm spending money twice. I can't do this. And then the other reason, sorry to interrupt Jacque, but when you get into the collecting and become a collector, well, now the value is different if it's a first edition with the dust jacket autographed. So then it also became sometimes, well, I do have a copy, but then here's a first edition that's autographed. But with the Excel file, it helps to track that.
And now you guys have me in on this very expensive game.
You don't want to know what I've spent altogether, because I've kind of tracked that too. But I mean, honestly, and so I don't know how big Jacque's collection is now. I do know she definitely has books that I don't have. And but the other thing is, you can really get into collecting in aviation. You could end up collecting, you know, kitty wings and little model airplanes and on and on and on and on and on. You know, silverware off of every airline, you know, TWA trademarked and Pan Am trademarked, you know, forks and knives from first class service. You can collect it all. I mean, it's all out there.
Right.
And I decided I'm focusing on books because, and I think Jacque and I are of the same mindset here. These women are amazing. Yeah. And they are fascinating. They have fascinating stories to tell. We've a lot we can learn from them, and they live on. Yeah. And I wanted to know about them. And so most of my books are nonfiction. And, you know, I do have a few that are fiction, but anyway. So that's where I focused. And so I don't have a lot of other aviation stuff, collector's items or memorabilia. It's books for me.
Yeah.
And you do find with book reviewing and being a beta reader for someone who is developing their book or their memoir, that expands the books too. If I were home, I would show you the background of what I have. But it's such a window into who some of these women were. It is just fascinating. And I've found that going back and reading some of them with where I am now, my perception of that first read has changed a lot. And so I very rarely go back and reread something, but this project has kind of chunked that rock in my pond. And I have gone back and reread. And my perception now is different than it was before, based on where I am and who I am. So it's been fun.
So I just wanted to pull out, again, because I have a spreadsheet, what's my oldest book? And I got this book. So this is it's The Girl Aviators on Golden Wings. It's part of a series. Jackie has the whole series, I think. I think I have two of them. And Jackie.
Wow.
Yeah. And so it's fiction. Uh-huh. But what I want to point out is, when we complain, like we wish there were more women in this industry, and then the response is, well, women just don't want to do this, and you need to promote this more to women and girls. Right. This is a book promoting aviation to girls in 1911.
Yeah.
This is a book for girls. This is not a memoir or a book for adults. So don't tell me that hasn't happened, hasn't been happening for over 100 years.
Exactly. Well, but again, like if you look at the wave of women in aviation, and you look at the influence that World War II had on that, and the post World War II sort of backlash that really affected the numbers of women in aviation. Because if you look through the 20s and 30s, you see we have all of these incredible women, these pioneers who were doing great things. So
I recently wrote a concise summary of that, which goes like this. Women flew in the WASP, in the ATA and the WASP. They flew every aircraft model that the military produced. They flew them all. And the Tuskegee Airmen, who were black pilots, they were 4 black squadrons of black pilots. They flew and distinguished themselves in World War II. What happened? After the war, all the women were sent home, mm-hmm. and women were barred from military flying mm-hmm. and airline flying yep. for almost 30 years.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't from 1945 mm-hmm. to 1973, correct, women could not fly for the 2 biggest segments of aviation, right. military and airline. None. 0.
Right.
And black men were barred from airline flying. None were hired until one took his case to the Supreme Court, a discrimination case to the Supreme Court, where he prevailed in 1964. Mm-hmm. So 20 years for black men and 30 years for all women. Mm-hmm. And that is a big reason behind our numbers as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we've been, I look at it, I come into it in 1996 or 98 was when I was in flight school with the Navy. And I'm like, what's the big deal? I don't understand why. I just did not.
But the combat exclusion had only just been lifted, and Marine pilots only allowed women in 1994.
Correct. Exactly right.
2 years before you learn to fly. I know.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, so you have just summed up so much about why I'm so passionate about my project, to not just, we're looking at historical books. That's what we're going to be discussing in the book club. We discuss a wide range of books. This month in May, I am pushing children's books because that's really where my passion lies. Like you talked about, Jenny, we need to expose our young people to what's possible and pull out these historical. Maybe we can get some of these back in print. She's holding up, for those who are listening, she's holding up Wins Her Wings by Dorothy Wayne. I wonder.
Dorothy Dixon Wins Her Wings. That's from 1933.
And there's a whole series.
And Linda Carlton, Air Pilot, 1931. These are
children's
books for young girls. Children's books.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the Golden Annual Book for Girls, 1936.
I've stocked the airport here with those books, because this is where, when we had the fire 2 years ago and several others, all the helicopters base out of Angel Fire. And so there are some wonderful older books, but oh my gosh, I am so impressed with what's coming out now. I'm having a ball reviewing the new books.
I know we really do. I think what the changes in publishing are allowing us to have a much stronger voice. And then, as you know, I want, even though you can publish anything, I would like us collectively to, spit and polish our work so that it can reach as broad an audience as possible and be more accessible to people outside of aviation so we can educate them. So all of these things are so good. So we should talk about the first book we're going to discuss. And there's I felt very strongly about doing this book for a variety of reasons. But Jacque, what are we going to start off with?
Louise Thaden's memoir, High, Wide, and Frightened.
It's so exciting. And Jenny just got up to go get her copy. Which copy is this?
3 copies. Well, I'll just start. So we'll talk about it more. But it actually was originally published in 1938. This was my grandparents' copy.
Wow. And
then another version came out in 75, I believe it was. Slightly changed. And then this version. So
we'll
this
talk version? About that. What was the publication date on the new version? This is the one that people, if they go to buy it, they're most likely
going to get this one. I'm sorry, I didn't. In 2004.
2004 was that print of it. High, Wide,
yes, and it's the one with the foreword by Patty Wagstaff.
That's right. It has a foreword by Patty Wagstaff, which is awesome as well.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be so fun to talk about this book, and the list that we have of books is just, it's just a matter of picking which direction to go from there. But the reason we started with this one is, so I will give my reasons. As we know, the most well-known name in women in aviation is Amelia Earhart. And with all of the respect in the world that she deserves, she wasn't the only one. And not only that, even though she was the founding president of the 99s, it was Louise Thaden, I believe, who kind of instigated this whole thing. And so they both reached out to all of the women in aviation at the time who were licensed and invited them to be part of this organization. She also won the Bendix, which was awesome. So she's a fabulous pilot and an important historical figure that I don't think comes into the spotlight enough. So what about you guys? Do you have anything to add to that?
I was brought back into that realm with a friend who lives in Bentonville, Arkansas, and they have a charter school that is the Louise Thaden Charter School. And so she got me sucked back into looking more closely at Thaden, and that was 10 years ago. And so there's just a lot of serendipity with this woman for me.
So for me, because I've read the book and then done some more research, which we'll talk about when we do the actual discussion of the book at a later interview. But one of the reasons that I think it's the perfect choice to launch this series is because she wrote and published her book contemporaneously. She didn't wait until she was, older to sit down and write her memoirs. She did it right in a year that right after she did the most amazing flying. And when I looked into it, hers is one of the very earliest memoirs published by a woman pilot. So it was very timely and about those times. And of course, about what we call the golden age of aviation and a little bit about the pioneering age. So it's just the perfect book to launch this series. So well done, Liz.
I know. Oh, well, you guys, thank you. I mean, you had input in that as well. And I cannot wait to talk about it. I'm going to restrain myself, but all I'm going to say is that anybody listening to this, look forward to our discussion about it. But I can absolutely highly recommend this as a fabulous read for any pilot. Everybody should read this as part of our history. I think I've gone around saying things like, West with the Night by Beryl Markham is the classic, book featuring a female aviator. I am definitely going to be schooled on this. I can tell already just by having read this book. And so that list is going to get much longer, and I can't wait for that.
Yeah, she's amazing pilot, and she's a brilliant writer. And
Actually,
it's very well written. It's poignant. It's gripping, and it's really, really a good book. So I recommend it highly.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait. So that'll be in our next session. Ladies, do you have anything else that you'd like to share? Any parting thoughts?
Well, thanks for inviting us. This is going to be a lot of fun.
And I'm all on board.
Well, I am so excited to be doing this with you two. Your enthusiasm is contagious, and your tenacity to get this interview done, which has been a saga. And so it's been such a pleasure to actually get to hear your stories so that we can prepare ourselves to delve into others. Thanks so much, ladies.
Yeah, thank you, Liz.
You.
Looking forward to it. Thanks so much for listening. Check out the Literary Aviatrix website for this and hundreds of other books by or featuring women in aviation in all genres for all ages. And while you're there, sign up for the Literary Aviatrix newsletter to stay up to date on all of the Aviatrix book news. If you enjoyed this interview on YouTube or podcast, please like, subscribe, and drop a review if the option is available. Just like book reviews, podcast reviews help our stories reach a broader audience. I'd like to thank Michael Wilds of Massif & Crew for his help producing this interview and his support of all things Literary Aviatrix. Blue skies and happy reading.
I'm ready to go again. I'm ready to say goodbye when the sky is high. No reason to stay.